Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Cyber Policy Center's weekly seminar. We'll be holding on for about a minute just to allow everybody to come on in, and then we'll hear from our friend and colleague, Dean Freelon. Okay, welcome again to the Cyber Policy Center's weekly seminar. My name is Jeff Hancock, and I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Dean Freelon. Dean does really fantastic work, both content-wise, in particular looking at social media, issues of power. We've just covered his work on Black Lives Matter and measuring and understanding power that those kind of social movements can have on social media in our class. And he also does a ton of work for our field on producing tools. So if you're somebody that ever needs to calculate reliability statistics, then Dean's got a really great suite of tools, but all kinds of other things. And I'm excited today because he's going to show us PIEGraph, and he just let me know before we started the talk that this is the first time he's done this talk, and he's excited / nervous to demo the tool live. So I think we're all in for a treat to see a tool that can get us up outside of individual platforms and take a more, what Dean calls, a user-centered view of analysis. And so I'm really excited to have Dean Freelon with us today. He's associate professor at UNC. And Dean, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can see what I'm going to do. Oh, that's the Sanford page. Okay, great. There we go. So that should, let me inflate this real quick. Okay, there we go. So as Jeff mentioned, this is the first time I'm giving this presentation. I hope it will be as interesting and informative as you expect. Talking about a new software program that I am spearheading the development of that hopefully will add a contribution to the kinds of research that we can do with social media sources. It has its own advantages and disadvantages, which I'm happy to get into. So let me proceed. So theoretically, I'm coming at this from an echo chamber / filter bubble standpoint, specifically the fact these ideas seem to have outlived their theoretical usefulness. But I tell my students this all the time. We talk a lot about crossover theories, right? So these are theories that come from the academy and somehow manage to get purchase in the non-academic world. So I went on a run this morning, very refreshing. And I actually had a song on there, nice pumping metal song. It was called Echo Chamber, right? So this is something that's really making it into the music world. Very few theories are able to do this. But really in the fields of communication and political science, this idea that people are ensconced in a hermetic bubble only containing content they agree with not really borne out by empirical reality. So one major finding here is that people are typically more attracted to attitude consistent content than they are repulsed by attitude inconsistent content. So there's a bit of an asymmetry. There's a lot of findings related to this, but this is the concept that I think most people have heard of, and one that I am using PIEGraph hopefully to help advance us past. And so I've taken to calling this, and if there's a better word for this, or if somebody has, if there's a one term that is widely used instead of this, please let me know. I've looked around and I have some examples at the bottom of this slide. I've taken to referring to or using as an abstract term, theoretical term, to refer to social media environments. I call them personalized information environments. And on an abstract level, these are co-constructed by users and platforms. So the users supply folks that they follow or friend, and platforms supply algorithms that incorporate different pieces of content, some of which are paid, some of which are simply prioritized and are organic content, but they're co-created. Importantly, and differently from echo chamber and filter bubble, this term, personalized information environments, implies nothing about the contents of the environments, which may vary widely depending on a number of factors, right? So it's not saying, well, we know that it's hermetically sealed and it's only attitude consistent content. Could be a wide variety of content. Its defining characteristic, in other words, is that it is personalized. And so other theoretical concepts that are similar include mass self-communication, disintermediated media systems, we've heard of this, and public spherules. But none of these, I think, have really gotten like a whole lot of purchase. So if there's one that I'm missing, it's entirely possible. You can let me know about that. I want to talk about this idea of what I'm calling the Usereye View. Now, this concept is not like entirely new. In fact, I'm actually building on a former colleague of mine, still a colleague, but I used to work in the same department as her. Erica mentioned Trevino, who had this idea of vertical data, right? So this idea that traditional big data, or the data that we collect, that many people collect in sort of a traditional way, if we do have traditions, only having done big data and communication for a little over a decade, as we understand it, that horizontal data is a little bit of data about a lot of people, vertical data being a lot of data about a smaller number of people. I think that this idea could use a fresh conceptualization, which is why I call it the Usereye View. It's a little bit different from mentioned Trevino's conception, which is fundamentally cross-platform. Right now, unfortunately, PIEGraph only supports one platform, but it can support others. That is a policy problem, not a technical problem, as I'll talk about in a little bit. The purpose, as the term Usereye View implies, is to see as the user sees, right? In most sort of keyword-based sampling mechanisms that construct data sets based on social media do not do this. And so PIEGraph is far from the first approach, but it, I think, is a unique one that will add some value to the suite of tools that people use to do this. As those of you who have conducted this research know, it is methodologically difficult and expensive, right? So compared to the sort of keyword and sample approach, very cheap. That's not that hard to do. Lots of people do it. If you're trying to track Usereye View stuff, it's time intensive, it's labor intensive, and typically it is expensive in terms of money. So the platform-centered view is one with which some of you will be familiar. This visualization is adapted from Atomic and Glance 2004, which is a paper with which, again, some of you may be familiar, graphing weblogs left and right. And typically the way that works is, you have a keyword of interest. I do a lot of work on Black Lives Matter, disinformation. So you sample based on these keywords, or you sample sometimes based on a user set, and you can get a lot of social media messages that way. And you can map out the social networks. You can do content analyses, all sorts of analyses. But basically, you are topic-based sampling, or you are sampling based on individuals that are related to your topic in some kind of way. And so you're sort of looking at it from the outside. You're seeing how the topic is being engaged with by a large number of people, but you don't get that user-centered view, which is really what this particular project is about. And I really don't want to disparage the platform view at all. I've done a lot of work in that mode, and I plan on doing more. It's really just a tool and a perspective that is valuable for particular types of analysis. And so the two sides of this slide are not intended to be exhaustive, but just a few examples of some of the things that platform views are good for, and some of the things that the Usereye View is good for. So platform views, as I mentioned, are good for studying particular topics, understanding online group dynamics, and so it's a fundamentally sociological approach. Another example would be examining influencers and who they influence. So if you sample, for example, a bunch of people who are influencers in a particular area, whether that's entertainment or politics or medicine, then you can map out those connections and see the kinds of sub networks that they are able to influence. The Usereye View is actually good for a number of very different research goals. And so one general one is understanding the content of specific personalized information environments, right? That's a very, very general one. Being able to see the content that any given user sees, regardless of the topic that it may focus on. Determining how informational diversity changes over time on an individual level. So There may be times when an individual's personalized information environment is high in diversity, when it goes low in diversity, and trying to figure out what accounts for those kinds of temporal dynamics. And then another one is ascertaining the amount of low-fact content in people's streams, right? So you can actually, so the platform view would actually look at how much, mis or disinformation there might be within a given platform. The Usereye View would say, well, how much of this content do different types of individuals actually end up seeing, or how much actually ends up in their information stream? So very, very different approaches to a very broad question that the platform view would take versus the Usereye View. I want to give some acknowledgement to other approaches that have engaged with the Usereye View, and I'm going to take 3 examples of pieces of software that have done this, some of which you may be familiar with. And I'm just going to talk through them. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind as I'm going through this is contrasting and comparing with the PIEGraph system that I'll show you a little bit later on. So the first one is NetQuest. And this one is actually gaining popularity amongst people in my discipline, communication. I've seen some other studies of it in information science as well. NetQuest is a company that offers access to a panel of users who consent to mobile and web tracking. So in other words, they sign up for this panel, presumably they are compensated in some kind of way, and they install apps on their mobile devices and web-enabled laptops and have their content tracked. And so the data that NetQuest offer consists of web URLs, the domains, which are a subset of the URLs, and then the timestamps, and a unique identifier. The IDs are hashed so you can track people, but you don't know who they are. And then researchers, of course, can see URLs of whatever sites that panelists visited. So in other words, if they're in a social media system, they see, okay, well, they went to Twitter or they went to Facebook, they went to TikTok. And if they click on something, then they can say, oh, well, they went out, to the Daily Beast, or they went out to Breitbart or whatever. But they can't see what exactly they are seeing when they are in that social media system. Next one is called WebHistorian, again, developed by my former colleague, Erica Mention-Trevino at American University. This is a browser extension that reads users' Chrome histories. It collects full URLs and timestamps, very similar to NetQuest. It is open source, so anybody can download that and use it for their own purposes. Interestingly, and this is another similarity that PIEGraph shares with WebHistorian, is its output is actually available to end users to help them visualize and understand their own information stream. So if you want insight into your browsing habits, you can check out one of these visualizations, like the one on the slide that WebHistorian provides. And later on, you'll see one of the visualizations that PIEGraph provides, and so that you'll be able to have some understanding on an individual level of your own information stream. And this is interesting because we're not just taking data, we're also trying to give something back to the people that are helping to contribute to our research as participants. Third one is one that you may be familiar with. This is the Human Screenome project that is run by the Screenomics Lab at your very university, Stanford. And this is a project wherein users install software on their devices that take a screenshot every 5 seconds. So this is a very data-intensive undertaking, very impressive from a technical level. I can only imagine how much it costs to do all this. Storing it as well as paying the programmers to actually create the software. One really cool advantage that I really think is great about Screenomics or the Screenome project is that it's not limited to social media or even internet connected apps. Anything that appears on your screen, it's going to take a picture of that, whether it's something that you have on offline mode or whether it's something that you're connected to social media, whatever app it is, it can get that information. Supports Windows, Mac, and Android. No iPhone support yet, but a wide variety of platforms that this project supports. And then when it pulls the data off of the screens, it conducts OCR to extract the text, automated image tagging, and human labeling, which obviously it can only do on a subset of the data that it collects because it collects tons of screenshots. But that is some of the early processing that it does. And then obviously, with the images, you could do some more processing, but that's some of the first passes that they do. So that's the gist of the Human Screenome project, a little different than the previous two, certainly a very exciting project to look at and to follow within this space. So let me talk about PIEGraph. This is it stands for Personalized Information Environment Graph. I thought about calling it pie charts, but I didn't because pie charts are awful, not a great info visualization tool. So hence PIEGraph. PIEGraph, like all the ones that I just discussed, is a specific tool with specific advantages and disadvantages. And PIEGraph has three basic components. The first is a social media app that collects Usereye data via API. Currently, PIEGraph only supports Twitter, but again, we're trying to work on and figure out what other social media platforms it could support. The basic architecture is compatible with basically anything that allows you to that offers particular types of APIs. Second component is a database of over 3,000 web domains that are pre-tagged for political bias and factual content. These data come from Media Bias Fact Check, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the third component is a survey to collect basic demographic, political, and media opinion data from an opt-in panel of users. So we're currently trying to get those folks enrolled. Some, logistical issues that we're running into there, but hopefully we'll get those folks squared away and they'll be able to start donating. Well, not really donating. Basically, we're paying them via incentives to give us their data. And so hopefully that piece will start soon. So here's a link to PIEGraph. Technically, you can go to this link yourself, but I'm going to ask you not to do that right now because there's a lot more people than I expected in the audience, and I would greatly prefer to be able to give this demo without the system crashing. So I'm going to show you all what this looks like real quick, and I'm going to show you my own personal version of this. So here is my version. So I click on Login, Authorize App, and then it does the authorization, does your little handshake, pops back, boom, and here is my particular chart that I see on an individual basis. And so let me talk a little bit about what you're seeing on the screen here. So the first thing is, I'll reposition this just a little bit. So this is a chart. The axes here, you've got a horizontal x-axis, vertical y-axis. Now, the horizontal axis maps onto political ideology, left and right. So left indicating more liberal, left-leaning views, go away synchronization. And then of course the right symbolizing more conservative views. The vertical dimension, as you can see here, is factual content. And that is the media bias fact check designation for the level of fact content of that particular domain. So the higher you get, the more fact content that it has. That particular scale ranges between 3 and -2. And so -2 is the lowest fact value, 3 is the highest. 0 corresponds to mixed factual content. So let me mouse over and show you just a couple of these. My biggest domain that I have here is Slate, occurring almost 3,000 times over the past month and a half, a little bit longer than that. The Washington Post is another big one. Left bias, according to Media Bias Fact Check. Let's see, Mashable, CNN, Mediaite, in these times in the root. Toward the center, we see WRL, which is our local, some network affiliate, I can't remember which one. Chronicle of Higher Ed, Associated Press, Gallup. Some right-leaning ones include the Wall Street Journal, Politicite, 1600 Daily, New York Post, Daily Mail, and Washington Free Beacon. Ooh, Fox News is in there too, 5 times. So you can see that mine is heavily slanted to the left and also above the x-axis in terms of fact content. So there's a couple other, this is all sort of, we haven't totally finished it. We have a bunch of other stuff we got to put on here, but this is the core of the functionality. When you scroll down, you can see chart data. You can see some information here. So these are the top 10 most frequently occurring items. They've also been binned. You can see political affiliation here from left, et cetera, some center ones. In terms of number of occurrences, you see this here. Credibility, this actually needs to be changed to factual content. So we'll get that changed. I need to see that. We'll take a look at home timeline tweets. One thing about home timeline tweets that's kind of cool is you can actually see the tweets that this data comes from. So in other words, you can actually take a look at that. Usually takes a second to load, so it's going to pop over because my Twitter timeline tends to be a bit dense. So that is something that is going to take a second to load up there. JavaScript here is a little bit, let's wait here. So hopefully that will pop up. And, oh, there it is. Right. So yeah, it does take a second. So here are the tweets that comes from. You can see these tweets and they're just loaded in here. Also, only I can see my own particular PIEGraph. People who are not me can't see mine. That's what the login piece does. And so I can explore this. I can also do searches for particular strings, and that just searches across all fields, which is pretty neat. And then some very basic tweet statistics. I think this is probably going to take a second again. Okay, here we go. So this is basically mean, median, and standard deviations for. Okay, what has happened? I just saw it and then it went away. So yeah, we're still working out some of the bugs on here. I'm going to see if I can't get that back real quick because I saw it for a second and then there it goes. Okay, great. So this should say sort of credibility should say fact content, and so I can see that my fact content is a little bit higher than the average. The pi credibility is supposed to be an average of everybody who's in the system. Once we get our user base in there, which will be demographically matched to the United States, this will have a little bit more credibility, to a little bit more credence to it. And then I can see that mine is a little bit more left-leaning than everybody else who's in the system here. And so this is a basic look at what we're going to get. There's a few other elements, like we need to add, frequently asked questions list and how to disenroll yourself from the study and the rest of it. But this is the basic aspect of the technology. This is the front end, what the user sees, and I'll give a look at the back end in a little bit. So this is sort of the basics of kind of what I'm working with here. So let me switch back to this PowerPoint slide. You can take a look at this if you want, only if you really want to, because I would prefer that the system not crash, and we haven't stress tested it yet, so it very well might if every single person ends up signing up for this. And I assume that not all of you have Twitter accounts, and so you have to have a Twitter account to make it work. Let me talk a little bit about media bias fact check, which is the source of our data. This is a comprehensive, the site that has comprehensive coverage of many widely used English language news and political sites. There are detailed explanations of ratings. The site is nonpartisan. Data from this site have been used in multiple peer-reviewed studies, including the ones that are included on this slide. So it's a pretty good, site that basically gives ratings in terms of ideology and factual content. You can visit it. It's mediabiasfactcheck.com, so that you can check out how it ends up giving those ratings to the different sites. And of course, it has to be manually rated by the site, so there's a bunch that aren't included, but we feel like it's a pretty good start. And also the data were free, which is super nice. So here is just one look at how media bias fact check rates the New York Times, rates it as left of center, high, the second highest level of factual reporting. And then here's the specific page for media bias fact check / New York Times. But this is sort of what you get when you look at New York Times' page on media bias fact check. So I'm going to show you a bit of my PIEGraph data now. So this all comes from my own personal data. The time span of this runs from October 1st through November 14th, which was just 2 days ago. It includes just a shy of 10,000 tweets. And these tweets, that's not all the tweets that occurred on my feed during that time. This is tweets by people I follow, not my own tweets, right? So this is all the content that people I follow produce and that I see within my personalized information environment of Twitter. But this is not the total number of tweets over that time. This only includes tweets that contained a link in our pre-tag database. So everything else is excluded. We'll have to work around how to get at that in future revisions. There are 326 unique domains and 828 unique users contributing to this data. So first one, this is actually something I showed and something that every user can view. This is my top domains. You can see the Slate is number 1. And then down the line here, ABC 11 is our local ABC affiliate, NewYorkTimes.com, The Nation, The Verge, Washington Post, Wired, Mashable, WRAL, which is another network affiliate TV channel, and Democracy Now! So, pretty standard, lefty professor stuff, right? So anybody who thinks professors are left-wing are definitely going to see me as indicative of that. Definitely not breaking the mold at all there. So that's my top domains. One thing that the PIEGraph interface does not show is the top most frequently tweeting users in my feed. Slate, again, takes the top spot. One thing that's different, actually a lot of these are the Twitter accounts of the equivalent web domains on the previous slide. Two users that are not in that category are Inside Higher Ed and The Chronicle, which of course, obviously being a higher education professional, they produce lots of news of interest to me. And so they didn't make it on the top domains. They did make it onto the top user list. This is what I call a chart of my fact bins. And so I've taken every single domain. And what I've done is I've said how many of those domains had each media biased fact check rating. So there were none, actually, well, I think it's probably like maybe one or two, and these are percentages on the y-axis for -1, less than 5% for 0, just shy of 20% for mostly factual, almost 75% high, and just a very small number of very high there. So the vast majority being 1 or above, mostly factual or above. And so, seems pretty good. That second highest level is, of course, my largest bin by far. This is my fact and political quadrants. And so, as you saw on the PIEGraph, you saw there were 4 quadrants. There was left and, above 0, right and above 0, right and below 0, and left and below 0. And so this basically splits all the links into those 4 categories. You can see that well over almost 95% of my content is left of the y-axis and north of the x-axis. So that's in the upper left corner. Everything else, that last a little bit over 5%, is distributed among the remaining 3 quadrants. As you can see, I have a little bit of left content that is below the axis that is mixed or below. So not really great. Maybe I should work on trying to get rid of that. Then my, in terms of, I have very little right-wing content, but the vast majority of the right content that I do have is above that x-axis, indicating that it is above the category of mixed. And I have a very, very tiny amount of right-wing content that is below the x-axis. So by my count, I'm doing pretty good here. But that's just a way of, this is just another view of that quantifies the total amount of content that fits into those quadrants. This is my mean factual content over time. This chart is kind of boring, but I think I'm trying to present it or show it to you so that you can see how it could be interesting for some people who are not me. And so basically this shows that the average factual content per day that I have tends to fluctuate within a very narrow band between 1.5 and 2. My idea here is that there might be certain times or certain incidents that may cause low fact content to really spike for some people. So, developments related to the vaccine or to the January 6th, post-mortem events. And so mine is not very dynamic, but, it very well could be for certain people. And here is a look at my low fact friends. Friends is what Twitter calls people that you follow. So basically, this is a representation of all of my users that I follow that posted at least 1 link in the database and had at least 5 posts. Actually, no, at least 5 posts in the database, sorry. And whose total proportion of links below that were at 0 or below was 10% or higher. So there were 42 of such users. And you can see that there were a couple of users who had 100% of links that were 0 or below. That's AJ English or Cocoa Butter BF, and that's because Al Jazeera is rated a 0, and so is BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed News is actually rated a 1. BuzzFeed, regular BuzzFeed, is rated a 0. And so these two being official accounts of those two mean that they only post content from those 2 sources, and that's why they're at 100%. What's interesting about this is that not all users who post low fact content are necessarily believe it. Sometimes they're saying, look at this low fact content, or look at this, terribleness that I'm going to debunk. So there are some academics in here. Holly Semetko is a political scientist at Emory. Rasmus Kleist Nielsen is at Oxford. Klangable, I believe, is at UMass, one of the UMasses, I can't remember which one. Jay Benton is a journalist. Ubiquity 75 is an information scientist at UCLA. So Dr. Ibram is Ibram X. Kendi, who is at Boston University, I believe. Danigal is at University of Delaware. So a lot of academics in here, presumably, who know what they're talking about. So just because you post something that is low fact in nature doesn't necessarily mean that you're endorsing it. You could very well be debunking it. And so that's but a look at some of these folks who are posting some of that low fact content to my feed. Let me just take a really quick look, wrapping up PIEGraph versus similar approaches. Some of the distinct advantages that PIEGraph has allows you to see what the user says. Clicks are not required. So, something like NetQuest and WebHistorian would only be able to see specific Twitter links if you clicked on them. It doesn't see things that you just, view through Twitter and just happen to flash across your timeline. PIEGraph also captures more than URLs. It captures hashtags, the full text of the tweet, as well as usernames. You can analyze, you have more data to analyze there. It covers both mobile and laptop content through API access, which is kind of neat. So no need for mobile and laptop apps, because it all comes through the API, and so you get anything that they would have seen through either interface. The pre-tag database is highly extensible, and we'll talk about that in the forthcoming slides. The system is lightweight, non-intrusive, and fault tolerant. In other words, you don't have to worry about crashing systems or anything like that, or maybe one particular app ends up with a bug in it and there's a problem there because it operates through the API. The only thing that could possibly be buggy is the centralized system that's pulling all the data through, and not something that's installed on all the users' particular systems. And finally, it's open source, which is great. So people who want to do that, or it will be. It's not open source now. It will be when we're done with it. And people who want to use this will be able to adapt it to their own purposes. It does have a few distinct disadvantages. Right now, it only supports Twitter. The basic architecture has the potential to support multiple platforms, but there has to be an API that offers sort of a viewpoint that allows you to see what the user is following. The architecture doesn't support non-internet apps, which puts it at a disadvantage relative to the internet the Screenome project. It doesn't capture what users click on, so it only provides a view of the potential, information environment and not what people actually engage with. And that's an advantage that NetQuest and WebHistorian have over it. Finally, it is vulnerable to changes in corporate data policy. And this is something I discuss in my paper, Computational Research in the Post-API Age, which came out in 2018. And that's true of anything that uses an API. If the company all of a sudden decides to shut that API down, then any software built on top of it is going to stop working. That happened to me with an earlier app I created for Facebook. And so clearly I'm just a glutton for punishment, developing this new system that is really at the mercy of the existence of the API that it takes advantage of. Current research project, let's talk a little bit about that. We're recruiting 1,000 US demographically matched users from a panel company. Each one will fill out a survey and grant PIEGraph permission to collect their data. As I showed, they're going to see that. After they fill out the survey, they're going to see that screen. Grant permissions to PIEGraph, yes. After they do that, they get their compensation, and critically, no further participant action or background software is required after they grant access. So it's totally transparent to the user. It tracks all of the data. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to go anywhere. We just pull in all the data until they pull out of the study. Participants can opt out anytime via instructions on our website, which will be there, not there yet. And we have the funding to track participants for the minimum of a year. We're going to gather some very, very rich data over that time. We're planning multiple studies that are going to emerge from that. I think it's going to be really, really interesting what it's going to reveal about how people's opinions relate to the kind of information environment in which they sort of swim, as it were. So I'm really excited about being able to get that started as soon as some red tape ends up getting resolved at the university level far above my pay grade. We'll be able to get those people in and running because we've got all the funding and all of that. Okay, let's see here. So a few next steps. These are some potential ways that PIEGraph could be extended. The pre-tag database, this is something that I feel like is actually not that complicated on a technical level, but folks really have not taken advantage of it. And so the examples that I provided here show tags in terms of political bias as well as factual content, but you can tag content along all sorts of different classification schemes of interest. So here are a few examples I came up with. So the topic class, the classification scheme that we look at right now is really about left and right and about factual content. But if you did a topic classification scheme that incorporated things like entertainment, education, health, and politics, and a bunch of other ones, you could allow users to analyze how individuals allocate their attention between different topics. So how much political content do people, how many political links do they see? How much entertainment stuff is there? How much health stuff is there? How much education is there? So really getting a sense of the total amount of content of different types that people end up consuming. If you had a gender tag database of very highly followed users that's tagged by race and gender, you could enable a study of racial diversity in personal information environments, which would be very interesting. So how much content do you get from individuals of various racial groups? How much do you get from women? How much do women get from women? How much do men get from women? Et cetera, et cetera. You could look at local news, analyzing a database of local TV, radio, and print outlets, trying to figure out how much of people's personalized information environments is constituted by local news, which would be really interesting to sort of track that. And the last one is you can actually combine the political and fact database, which we already have, with a broad classification of top influencers to reveal alternate routes by which apolitical people receive political content. So one example here would be like celebrities commenting on politics, or other people who are not in the traditional political sphere commenting and giving people information about politics, which I think would be really, really interesting. So these are just some examples. The general idea of tagging content and linking that to people's personalized information stream, I think, has a lot of really cool applications. And so we're going to try to exploit that to the fullest. Maybe even bring in, once the project gets going, bring in some collaborators. People have really good ideas for this. Once the papers get out, I'm really hoping that folks will be able to bring their ideas to us so that we will be able to, extend how this works into new sort of areas there. Let me just offer a last couple of thoughts about seeing like a user. The general insight or assumption that PIEGraph is built on is that people are affected by much more than what they click on or engage with. So, for example, exposure to headlines, hashtags, and other inline content can shape people's views. And so there's research to this effect. If you're familiar with the illusory truth effect, that is statements that are repeated over and over again are perceived as true. You add confirmation bias to that, that's going to amplify the tendency for content that people are repeatedly exposed to influence people. It's going to amplify that tendency over time. And so PIEGraph is a tool to explore these kinds of dynamics. And it is, of course, complementary to other Usereye approaches. And so really, I don't want to say that this is the end all be all of the Usereye approach, but I do think it's complementary, and I do think that it does add a few things that existing approaches, as far as I know, do not offer. Although if they do, you can certainly let me know, and I will incorporate that information into the next version of this talk. I'm going to stop there and allow people to ask questions. I don't know how long this took. This was, I guess, not too bad, like 40 minutes or so, a little bit less. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop there and let people ask whatever questions that they might have.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Really appreciate it. I'm going to give you some virtual applause so you're not sitting there in the void.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it was really great. It's hitting on a lot of things that a couple people in my research group and I have been thinking about. And so this looks like a really great new tool. And it also brings up a lot of big issues. We've got some questions in the Q&A module. So I'm going to start with those. And the first one is from Sean, I think, who starts asking why only Twitter, not Facebook? But I'm going to expand on that because I have a feeling I know why, policy-wise. But to get it, to realize your user-centric, user-level view idea, I think that's going to be important. So one thing that we're struggling with is this difference between static URLs and dynamic URLs. So in your Facebook news group, your Facebook feed. Could you tell us a little bit about like how PIEGraph will be able to deal with dynamic URLs, or if you're thinking about that? Or
so
you're just...
could you give an example of the difficulty here?
Right. So we're looking at matching people from that collected URLs via YouGov's Pulse extension. So we have all the URLs that they visited on the internet.
Yeah.
But if they go to Facebook, it'll just say like facebook.com kind of thing, and we won't see what they were in, because that's either their feed or it's in groups. Anything that takes place inside Facebook and their dynamic URL.
Yeah, and so right, yeah, exactly. So this is exactly the problem that PIEGraph was developed to solve. So the data that we pull out comes directly from the tokens that the users grant access to our app to be able to use. So literally, we see exactly what they see. The exact URL, whatever dynamic elements are within it, we see that. So there's no, truncation. Like we don't have to mess around with all the, the fact that you've got to click on something. So presumably with the YouGov thing, I assume it works kind of like NetQuest in that if they clicked on something, you'd be able to see it. But without that, you don't really know what it is. But we're able to see that because we do get that information directly from the API. So that's not really an issue for us. So in other words, if the URL itself is dynamic, we'll be able to see whatever elements are attached to it. If it's static, there shouldn't be any difference there. Now, I will say the difference between Facebook and Twitter is that, again, technically we can support Facebook. The problem is Facebook has been very reluctant as a company in terms of its policy. Post Cambridge Analytica, they've been very, very reluctant to grant access to research apps, which sucks. But we can't do it without, I can't hook PIEGraph up to Facebook without their permission. So, until they decide, that they're going to open that back up, we can't really do that. Now, before Cambridge Analytica, there were actually apps that were similar to that provided similar functionality what PIEGraph offers, but they've cut access off to that. And they can cut it back on anytime they want to, but they haven't because it's in fact, the functionality that Cambridge Analytica exploited to such terrible PR is actually quite similar to what PIEGraph is trying to do. So my guess is that like they're not in a hurry to turn that crank or whatever. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at other social media systems that have very similar APIs to the ones we're using with Twitter to be able to do that. Another thing you could do, one thing we did think of was we could actually compensate people to export their Facebook data for us. The problem there is you only see what they post. So you don't see what they see, you see what they post. So it's better than nothing, but it wouldn't be comparable to what we would have from Twitter.
Yet one more big reason and iteration for the calls for Facebook to open up its data access. And I'll point to Nate's legal policy as a suggestion as one way to go forward with that. Thank you very much, Dean. Next question from Stephen Odundo. Thank you for explaining the pie chart and other systems. What are your thoughts on media biases and how it plays out in the Usereye View when the outlet is far left or far right?
It's also PIEGraph. Don't call it pie chart because pie charts are
right.
Anyway, so yes, so again, this is one of the things we'll be studying when we get our panel in. That's actually something I'm very interested in. So a lot of the research now, and I've done research on this, I've written about it, has really looked at the ideological asymmetry and disinformation and low quality content. And so this is something that will allow us to see that from a Usereye View, will allow people to answer questions. So the survey that we have allows them to answer questions about their opinions about mainstream media, their opinions about some of the new hyperpartisan media that are out there, as well as their political affiliations. So we'll be able to link that content with the stuff that they actually end up seeing in their Twitter feeds. And so what that will do is it'll allow us to sort of line up what they believe about themselves and their opinions with what they actually see when they're on Twitter. And so I think that'll be really interesting. So a lot of the literature suggests that the vast majority of the mis and disinformation, low quality content is on the right. And so we'll be able to see how much that manifests and pops up for people who claim to be liberal versus those who claim to be conservative. So I'm really excited about exploring that. I can't really say a whole lot about it yet because we haven't found the users on there, but that will definitely be something that we look into once we get our population loaded into the system.
Okay, great. A couple of technical questions around PIEGraph. So can you use your Twitter, your archived history, for example, to feed the data into PIEGraph?
So PIEGraph is a prospective system. So in other words, when you sign up for it, I think it reaches back like a little bit. And actually, this depends on the total amount. Actually, I really need to stop and give all due credit to Andrew Christ, who's in the audience. He is a developer, really, really great guy. And I meant to do that on the slide, but as I said, I wrote this presentation today and I left that out. But thank you very much, Andrew. And what he's told me is that how far back you go depends on how dense your Twitter account is. So in other words, if you follow 10 people, it can go back a lot farther than if you follow 1,000. And so, but it is prospective. And the way the system works is it basically pulls in the data on a rolling basis. So it goes through and obviously respects all API limitations and all of that, collects it without any user intervention or the users having to do anything, puts it in there. And that's the purpose of it. So the idea is that from the point that you start and that you enroll in the study, from that point forward, it'll pull in the vast majority of content. We've tested it to make sure that we can have 1,000 users in there, and it will pull in like 95% of their content. So we're getting a full kind of 360 view within the Twitter sphere of what they're pulling in. And so that I think that'll be a really nice, a proof of concept for Twitter, and that will allow us to use that to expand to other social media systems that have comparable APIs.
Okay, one more technical one from Richard. What about laptop browsers like Firefox or Google or Brave? Is it supporting all of those?
It supports every possible browser through which you can view Twitter because it comes through the API. So basically, like, that's the great thing about it. It's the beauty of it, right? Like, you view Twitter on because it basically the concept is it divorces the need to have an actual client side application. So, that's actually one difference between all of the other alternatives and what we're doing. So NetQuest, Screenomics, and WebHistorian, you got to install something. This does not force you to install anything. Instead, what you do is you grant the application access to the same feed that you see through your Twitter interface, whether you're looking at that through a mobile device or whatever browser. So totally obviating that question. I love that about this system. And so really mobile support, you could be viewing this on an Apple Watch, I guess, if you can do that. But really not requiring installation of any kind of client-side software, I think is a major, and also just in terms of, there's no system drag, and there's also no possibility that the client-side app will fail. Now the central app could definitely fail, but there aren't like 1,000 client apps, any one of which could fail at any time, which greatly reduces the probability that there will be some kind of failure that will damage the data.
Okay, great. This is more of an application idea. I think really interesting, given some of the work we're doing as well. From Kate Herzog, do you see using PIEGraph? PIEGraph as a means to educate users about their news literacy bias? So using it as a way for people to reflect.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This, the story I tell about this is for anybody who's ever gone through an IRB application. There's that part where they ask you about like how your research will benefit like humanity, and like I always have to like before PIEGraph, I always had to say, well, it doesn't really do anything like directly, but like indirectly it kind of does. But here I was able to say, actually, there was a direct benefit for the participants in this because they get to see their charts and they get to get a nice like visualization of the how their links break down between left and right bias and between high fact content, low fact content, and they get some insight into what they're doing, and that's a nice little. They don't have to look at that, but they can if they want to, and they can sort of understand at least how media bias fact check has scored the various different types of links and domains that pop up in their personalized information environment. So I think that's a nice user education piece of it. We're going to have a nice, very full-featured fact that talks about all of how we made it work and some of the practical applications from a user standpoint. We're writing that up now, but absolutely, I think there is a user education component of that. And the navigational elements of the site will incorporate that once we get that up and running.
Are you envisioning any sort of formal evaluation or sort of like more scientific assessments? So maybe pre-post with some control, people that don't use it. These are some of the things we're doing with digital literacy interventions.
Yeah, we may do that. Right now, we have not. We haven't implemented any plans for doing any experimental work, but the system could be used for that. We'd have to figure out like a pretty good sort of control group, I guess, somebody who just like doesn't use it, or a group of people who rather don't use it, I guess. I think we might, before we do that, just we're going to do some user testing before we launch it, and we're going to just like get people's informal opinions, sort of focus group style. And I think that we might be able to in the future to do some more rigorous experimentation around it, but right now it's more sort of a long-term tracking kind of thing. But certainly the system could support that.
In this related vein, Julia just asked, what do you expect for behavior change? Like, is your sort of hope that, I see that I'm seeing a lot less, say, fact-based stuff right now, and that I will then change my behavior? Or is it that like, oh, I'm a boring person, I'm seeing too much fact stuff? I don't know, how do you imagine it sort of like leading to behavior change?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily have too many expectations that this will lead to behavior change. First of all, because like media-related behavior change is very difficult to implement. And certainly I expect that there will be some people who engage with a study who don't really agree with the media bias fact checks ratings. Obviously, people who think that, like Breitbart is fantastic and, the Gateway Pundit is really great are not really going to agree with that. The purpose of the project is not information change as such, or so rather behavioral change as such. It is to get a baseline of how people's opinions intersect with their media exposure in a very fine-grained way that I haven't seen in the literature yet. I think that this is something that certainly we could think about how to do that. I'm just trying to think on the fly about how to do that. I mean, I think that information is kind of a weak read to sort of place behavioral change on, right? This is why arguing with people on Twitter rarely changes their mind, right? Like that's just a sort of truism of the internet age. Behavioral change, I think, requires that you view low fact content as being bad. Some people don't necessarily have that viewpoint, and my guess is that like most of the people who think low fact content is bad will probably already have a small amount of it, and most people who have no problem with it or think is great are going to have a lot of it, and they have a lot of it because they think is great. So that I think is going to cause some inherent problems. In other words, there aren't a lot of people who think it's bad, but then just have a lot because they probably were able to prune it, before they access PIEGraph. So, I think it'll take some careful thinking about that. One idea we did have that we haven't implemented yet is to do the sort of like low fact friend analysis for the user. In other words, to say, here are the users that post the vast majority of your low fact content. Do you want to unfollow them? We haven't done that yet. In part because it would introduce some confounds into our study. So that's one problem there. But that's, going forward, that's one possibility if we can figure out how to like make it not confound our actual research.
Okay, great, thanks. Comment and question from Peter Stern. Thank you for an extremely lucid presentation. Does PIEGraph provide any insight into platform features like recommendations, ranking systems, etc.?
So I think indirectly it does, in that what we get through the API is to some extent a product of the algorithmic manipulations. But one thing that we don't see is we don't see the order. We see the order in which it was posted, but we don't see the order in which it appeared in somebody's feed. And we know that the default setting for Twitter is not strictly in chronological order. It's in some weird algorithmic order. And so that's one piece of information that is lost through the API. We can reconstruct the timeline, but not the sort of the algorithmic prioritization. Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of them that use those algorithms quite rightly have the details of those under wraps, their proprietary information. So absolutely, I think that there are ways to do that, but I don't think PIEGraph is the way. Rather, what we want to do is get a broader overview of the kinds of information that is swimming in people's personalized information environments. And if you have a situation in which 95% of the content is in one quadrant, you can get some sense of the fact that, like, regardless of how you prioritize, like, most of the stuff is going to be from that quadrant.
Gotcha. A lot of really just positive things here coming in. A lot of positive feedback and comments. One here is about is it possible to use the Internet Archive to archive the Twitter activities PIEGraph tracks? So I think people are getting interested in this idea of like going further back in their histories.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm trying to think. I suppose the Internet Archive is, they use some like not super transparent criteria to decide what they archive and what they don't. So there's one piece of it that we do know is that they tend to archive things that are high visibility, and obviously things that are like less visible, lower visibility, are less likely to be archived. You can also volunteer your content to be archived. So you can say, hey, watch this page, and it'll do that, I guess. The real question would be, what would be the point of that? So we're archiving the data ourselves, so we've got the information. And so one thing we might do is donate the content to some archive. Now, typically the Internet Archive does, save full web pages. And I think we would probably be more likely to drop our data into like a data repository where people could actually take advantage of that. I think that's something that we'll consider doing once the project is over. We'll generate a whole lot of data that I think can be incredibly useful. But I think that since we're not actually pulling down full web pages, I'm not sure that the Internet Archive would be the place to do that.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dean. We really appreciate you showing us this new tool you're developing. Excited that we were the first to get to see the demo of the tool, and we'll definitely be following up with you to see if we can use it in some of our studies and maybe on an evaluation intervention kind of study.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. I mean, I'm just looking at the bottom here to see a couple of questions. One question is about sentiment analysis. And so basically PIEGraph would be compatible with any sentiment tool that you might happen to apply to it. So you take your Python or your R tool, export the data, you analyze the sentiment yourself. And that's something else you could do on an individual basis. So in other words, one research question is, what about, sentiment between right and left people, the content that they're receiving in their personalized information environments, and how does that differ according to when they receive it? So like after election day, turns out it's a Republican route, or the Democrats end up hanging on to power. Like, does the positive or negative content end up dominating the feed of the side who lost? And you could absolutely do that kind of work. Also, somebody suggests that people are flooding Getter, which is President Trump's social media system. Not sure whether that's true. I think it would be really interesting if it was. It'd be interesting to see if they have an API that allows us to pull that data down. And so if it does become a highly visited site, we would certainly look into that.
Right on. And then one last one here. What do you think of the change trends and lack of interest in mainstream media and social media?
Yeah, that was one I
Got it.
so that was so actually just as a general point about alternative social media, like that's something that comes out in the the sort of Alexa rankings, right? So if you see Getter starting to contribute to compete with Facebook in terms of the numbers of monthly unique visitors, then my guess is it's probably nowhere close, although I could be wrong. But we'll see if that happens in mass. But now, what I would say is that like it is possible that some specific ideologies or certain individuals who believe certain things may then depart en masse for those kinds of things. We know that there are alt tech platforms that do that. But as far as being sort of a mainstream competitor to the big platforms, we'll have to see. I think it's probably too new to tell at this point.
Great. Well, thanks again, Dean. That wraps up our session for today, and just a more virtual appreciation, and thanks for a great talk. Everybody really enjoyed that. Next week is Thanksgiving, so we'll be taking a break from the CBC webinar series. But after that, we have Tanu Mitra, who I think just does fantastic work. And I think if you're a fan of hers or Eric Gilbert or Kate Starbird and that kind of work, then you're going to love Tanu's work. She does really great combination of deep and thoughtful computational social science that marries the technical with really well-grounded social science questions. And then following that is Sandra Gonzalez Balon, who spent a year here before during COVID at CAS, and she's just one of the best network thinkers out there and a great presenter. So I encourage you to attend both of those. That's it for now, and just one more big appreciation to Dean. Thanks so much, and look forward to seeing you in the real world sometime soon, Dean.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Take care, everybody. Bye.